Career right tackles like Oregon State's Taliese Fuaga and Alabama's J.C. Latham are shooting up the board for the New Orleans Saints, thanks to some bad news. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints. As a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're looking at answering three big questions here on Draft Week. Could the New Orleans Saints trade down? I'll tell you why this is a good year for it, but why, of course, they won't. What's the logic behind it, though, is really what we'll dig into. We're also going to take a look at whether or not the New Orleans Saints are in position here to really help out Trevor Penning with their new offensive system. How could it happen? And how offensive line coach John Benton could be the secret sauce when we look at Trevor Penning. But to kick us all off, New Orleans Saints getting some not so great news when it comes to Ryan Ramczyk, and therefore guys like J.C. Latham out of Alabama and Oregon State's Taliese Fuaga are now squarely in the mix for the New Orleans Saints at 14. Would they be good selections? We'll discuss. We appreciate you very much, as always, for tuning in for another episode of Locked On Saints. Make us your first listen of the day every day and being an everydayer here on the show as a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code Locked On for $20 off of your first purchase. Actually, it's promo code Locked On NFL. My apologies. Locked On NFL. It is that new promo code for $20 off of your first purchase. All right. So, Nick Underhill over at New Orleans Football putting out a piece on Monday. Is that what day it is right now? Yes, that is the day right now. On Monday, they kind of spoke a little bit more about like a Ryan Ramczyk update and stuff like that. I won't spoil the piece. You can go over to New Orleans Football and check it out. However, what I will tell you is that it's not great news. I mean, we've seen some things. I've heard some things. One of the reasons why I did the show that I did for Mock Draft Monday about Taliese Fuaga potentially being the pick for the New Orleans Saints makes a little bit more sense now, doesn't it? Why I would change my tune on Troy Fautanu so quickly. And a big part of it is because the New Orleans Saints might end up needing a ready-made starter at right tackle now, way more than they end up needing a ready-made starter at left tackle. We're going to discuss left tackle here a little bit more, but let me introduce you to J.C. Latham and Taliese Fuaga. Now, you've probably heard of both of these guys. They're consistently mocked to the New Orleans Saints. Both of them are career right tackles, although, a couple of guys having a little bit of experience when it comes to some interior offensive line action as well. Both guys, J.C. Latham and Taliese Fuaga, have been sort of looked at as guys that can move inside at the next level by some teams, but otherwise folks that they want to keep outside when it comes to others. And so this could be a way that the New Orleans Saints go in this year's draft, because at this point, we don't know if Ryan Ramczyk is going to play in 2024. We don't know if Ryan Ramczyk is going to play again, concerning reports about him losing weight and things like that. Like, all that stuff is there. These are all like little things that I've heard over the course of the last little bit too. And that's why you started to see like a little bit of the conversation around, oh, well, maybe it's Taliese Fuaga and a right tackle makes a little bit more sense than those other guys. Like, my guy might be Troy Fautanu, and he would be my selection, if all things were perfect in the world. But for the New Orleans Saints, things don't really feel necessarily perfect in the world for them. So addressing right tackle could make a ton of sense. And I know a lot of people will look at right tackle and go, well, that's not as important as left tackle. Left tackle blocks the blind side, but over on that right tackle spot is where you take on a lot of elite edge rushers. So being able to make sure you just haven't noticed because Ryan Ramczyk is an eraser of elite edge rushers over on that side, or has been in the recent past, or even up until the recent past. And so you got to find a guy that's going to be able to come in and help you with that. And let's say that everything miraculously just goes well with Ryan Ramczyk, right? Like, look, fluctuations in recovery happen and stuff like that. Sometimes they get really bad, sometimes they get really good, and then sometimes they swing wildly in the other direction. So let's just entertain the idea that, like, okay, well, everything's actually going to be fine for 2024. Nothing, we're all making a big thing out of nothing, right? Let's just say that that's the case. You still got to wonder if he's going to make it through 2024. You still got to wonder how things are going to go at 2025. At some point, there's just a human element that's involved in this. And Ryan Ramczyk caring for his family, caring for his health, makes a lot of sense if he were to say, you know what, hanging it up. And there's a lot of ways the Saints can go about this. They can make adjustments to the contract, even though they even though they restructured the deal, they can still make adjustments to the contract to help themselves out, help Ryan Ramczyk out in terms of retirement, help themselves out salary cap wise and things like that. Like there are things that can be done to help all of that. You see guys all the time drop their, salary to vet minimum and then retire on the vet minimum. That way the renegotiated contract already saves the money, and then you retire. And then, it's only the dead cap of the, minimum or whatever. That's what Drew Brees did. That's what Patrick Robinson did when he got outside and saw, he kind of said, man, this is a young man's game. And then he dipped like very quickly after that and all that. So like, there's a lot of those opportunities there in terms of being able to do that, do it the right way in such a way that does Ryan Ramczyk right, but also protects the Saints salary cap wise, and then gives them the money that they need to go out there and potentially make additional moves and stuff like that. There's still some free agents that are out there, all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of ways that the Saints can go with this. That'll save them some money in the future, more than it'll save it here right away, but still ways they can go about it. So with the concern around Ryan Ramczyk and his ability or potential availability for the beginning of the season and even potentially moving forward, it makes sense that the New Orleans Saints would make sure that they have somebody that can start at right tackle immediately, or at least be a successor in the past. Got to be ready for now and later in this situation. So a guy like J.C. Latham makes a lot of sense. 6'5", 342 pounds, slimmed down quite a bit for that 360 playing weight that he had over in Alabama. He also put on that weight for himself, now showing that he can slim off that weight, which I think is really important. Didn't really do any athletics testing, so he's not going to have the RAS score. That hasn't scared the New Orleans Saints in the past. If I recall correctly, I think Ryan Ramczyk also didn't have an RAS score, and also came in with less than or shorter than 34-inch arms, which is oftentimes an immediate concern for a player playing at tackle. That's not an issue for J.C. Latham, who has 35 1/8 inch arms and an 84 3/8 inch wingspan. So he's fine. He's got the length. He has the experience. 41 total games played, including 135 snaps, according to Dane Brugler at right guard, where he was backup guard as a freshman. So he's got a little bit of that inside-outside experience. All SEC last year, first team. I mean, just really, really good. And has experience in a system that will be similar to what it is that the New Orleans Saints want to run. They'll have a little bit of zone run overlap, a little bit of the split flow release. Split flow releases are those ones where you have the tight end, either tight end or a wide receiver, release for a route or block on the backside after crossing behind the line of scrimmage after the snap, all those things. So there's ways to incorporate that into this offense. I'm sure that you'll see it incorporated into this offense. And he's also got a lot of experience with Alabama with the duo run too, which we broke down before the Rams game, where you try to isolate that linebacker. Where the linebacker goes, you hit the other gap. The linebacker goes the other way, you hit the other gap. And all those other things. You're just trying to create two gaps, isolate the linebacker, and allow the running back to make the read on the linebacker and go the other way, basically. So those are all things that Kyle Shanahan had in his system last year, Sean McVay had in his system last year, that could go a long way if the Saints were to introduce those concepts to their system this year as well. And then Taliese Fuaga, who we've talked about quite a bit. A little bit shorter on the arms, but not too far shorter than Ryan Ramczyk. Comes in at sub 38, but he sits there at 33 1/8 inch, can still play over at the right tackle spot. Has a lot of athleticism, 6'5", 324 pounds, checks those boxes as well, gives you some speed, gives you some athleticism, ranked highly in the RAS, all those other things. And so either one of these guys can start for you day one at right tackle. I'm a little bit more Taliese Fuaga than I am J.C. Latham. My good friend John Hendricks from over at Saints News Network and our show Second and Saints, he's a little bit more J.C. Latham than he is Taliese Fuaga. So it could go either way here at this point, but I really like both of these guys as potential selections for the New Orleans Saints at 14, because it looks like the Saints are just going to have to be ready with a ready-made starter at right tackle. And if they're able to find that guy in this year's draft, they're going to have to invest in them, and these are two premier options that should be available there at 14. In order to really make the best of your offensive line, not only are you going to need that starter at right tackle, but you're also going to need to get the best out of Trevor Penning. And New Orleans Saints have all the tools to help get that right. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on. Take a look at the biggest questions, some of the biggest questions ahead of draft day for the New Orleans Saints going into the NFL draft. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Game Time is my favorite place to grab tickets. I'm going to be keeping an eye out on those Pelicans tickets when they and the Oklahoma City Thunder end up coming back here to New Orleans as the playoffs roll on. They almost stole Game 1 to get that home court advantage, which actually would have been great, potentially trying to get Zion back later on in the series, all those other things. But definitely one that I want to keep an eye out on. And I love to keep an eye out on it in person. Sometimes I'm a game time decision for going out to games, and game time helps me be okay with that because they've got deals all the way down to the beginning of the game and sometimes even an hour after the game as well. Zone deals where if you go out there and you buy a ticket with game time and you find a ticket in the same section, same row, they'll credit you back 110% of your purchase. It is awesome. And of course, they also have their game time ticket coverage that covers you for things like lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, 24-hour return guarantees, and so much more. You just can't beat Game Time. Go and check them out today. Download the Game Time app and take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time today. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the Game Time app and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, new promo code for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, family, if the New Orleans Saints want to get the best out of their offensive line, one of the things they're going to have to do is get Trevor Penning ready at left tackle. And honestly, they've got all the tools to do it. And a lot of those tools start with Ryan Ramczyk himself, but a little bit of the secret sauce might come from the new offensive line coach, John Benton. We appreciate you very much. As always, make it Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day. Hey, if you've been having your TV on ESPN, Fox Sports, stuff like that, and having to turn the volume down because of all the shouting, well, you don't have to worry about that. Make the switch over to Locked On Sports today. It's a 24/7 live stream on YouTube that's programmed specifically for you. Make sure you're getting all the biggest stories from around the world of sports with the folks that know it best and without all the screaming. You can head over to Locked On Sports today over on YouTube, where you can check out the 24/7 live stream, and you can also find it for free on the Amazon Fire TV channels app as well. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So for the New Orleans Saints, one of the things they're going to have to do potentially here is find a new starting right tackle. Yeah, we talked about JC Latham out of Alabama. Spoke a little bit about Taliese Fuaga. We'll dive a little bit more into those guys over the course of the next couple of days heading into the draft as well. But my prediction for the Saints is that one of those two guys is potentially going to be the selection at 14. As I mentioned, I'm a little bit more Fuaga than I am Team Fuaga, right? More than I am Team Latham, but I really like both of these guys for different purposes. And so that's all fine and dandy, though, like trying to find that starter at right tackle in this year's draft class. It's a talented draft class. There's a lot. If you want a little breakdown on that, I did a 1,800 word piece over at Saints News Network, just breaking down all the different like kind of possible top offensive tackles and other routes that the Saints could go to potentially address that position. You can find that over at Saints News Network. But the other thing that the New Orleans Saints need to be able to do is address their left tackle position. They don't necessarily have to do that with new talent. If Olu Fashanu was on the board out of Penn State at 14, you have to be tempted, right? But if he's not on the board, and then you go with one of those right tackles, Taliese Fuaga, JC Latham, or one of the other guys that can play right tackle as well, Patrick Paul maybe creeps up a bit, Tyler Guyton maybe creeps up a bit. Who knows? The draft's a crapshoot. And then you can do all that all you want, but you still have to address your left tackle spot. So you can address your left tackle spot with new talent if Olu Fashanu is on the board at 14, which would be hard to pass up, right? But you can also address your left tackle spot with a guy that's trying to regain the left tackle spot, the starting spot at that position in Trevor Penning. I do think that this new offensive system that Clint Kubiak is going to bring in, the wide zone offense that wants to rely on the aggressive run game or rely aggressively on the run game. It won't be 90%, 80% zone run, but you can expect greater than 50% of the Saints rushing attack to be in the zone run. Why is that important? Because it kind of just gets you moving, allows you to be aggressive as an offensive lineman. Feels like it plays to Trevor Penning's play temperament quite a bit. The other bit of that, though, is that you also have to look at what's happening in the passing game. A little bit of the motion to distract some of the defense, help the defense shift, maybe buy you a little bit more time, all those other things. Quick passing game that wants to get the ball out quickly. That's kind of evident that that's on the way with Andrew Janocko being brought in as the Saints' new quarterback coach, who's a genius when it comes to the quick passing game, all those other things. Like every piece of that really aged Trevor Penning in his development, in his growth, in his ability. It's a little bit more in his pocket too, right? In the pocket in terms of like the things that he really likes to do. He's a great run blocker. He's a good road grader. He's a good mauler. Like let him go out there and do that. And I think that this is something that new system, new scheme potentially brings that can aid Trevor Penning in taking over at left tackle. That's the Saints' best case scenario. is that they draft the guy that they get as their starter at right tackle for a long time. And Trevor Penning comes to life here in his third season and then becomes your long-standing left tackle after that. And then you're set at your bookends. You feel really good about Cesar Ruiz. You feel really, really good about Eric McCoy. Maybe you also bring in an interior offensive lineman to compete with James Hurst at left guard, or maybe you go to the free agent market post the draft to be able to maybe try to address that position. Lots of options there. But I'll tell you one of the other things to me that's kind of the secret weapon in this conversation is not only the new offensive coordinator, not only the aid of the quick passing game coming from the new quarterback coach, not just the new system, but also the new offensive line coach in John Benton. Everywhere that John Benton has gone has improved. And it's improved in terms of their production in the run game. It's improved in terms of their production, in terms of keeping their quarterback clean. Like in Houston, like sacks came all the way down. In San Francisco, sacks came down. Like there were so many of those places where like wherever he stepped onto his staff, sacks came down, rushing yards went up. And I think that's what you want to see from the New Orleans Saints this year, who didn't give up a ton of sacks last year, 34, 35, 36, somewhere in that general range. I apologize for not remembering the exact number off the top of my head. I think it was 35. But in any case, that's not a lot. That's not a lot, especially when you look at guys that are at the top of the league in some of these teams. And so I do think that like the Saints are in a better starting place than I think we give them credit for as an offensive line as a whole. It's clear where there's individual progress that needs to be made. I think that's fair. So you're at a better starting place than what we maybe tend to give them credit for. You've got a good scheme that's coming in that's going to halt pass rushes if the offensive run game is as productive as it should be. It's going to be a system that with its run game builds the confidence of its offensive line, which then impacts their ability as pass blockers in a positive way. And then a scheme that gets the ball out quickly of the quarterback's hands and into the hands of the playmakers so they can go and make plays downfield. Maybe a little bit more screens, maybe a little bit more stuff out into the flats to get these guys going as well. Some opportunities in the man run side of things. Because again, you're not going to run 100% zone run all the time. You're still going to mix in some man run. You can pull, counter, do all these other things that gets, Trevor Penning more involved in everything as well. So lots of good ways to kind of build the confidence back up, put him in a system that makes sense, put him in a system that feels comfortable, and get him coaching from a veteran coach that has consistently made offensive lines better, the Midas touch, wherever he goes. And so I do think that there's a best case scenario. I don't think we can expect it right now, right? Like it's not about building the expectation for that. You're just kind of looking at, okay, what's the vision? What's the hope? And that's the best case scenario for the New Orleans Saints, without a doubt. That Trevor Penning pans out as a long-term left tackle, or hell, pans out as a left tackle for 2024. And then the Saints get a long-term starter in the draft at the other side, help themselves out on the interior as well, and go back in with a little bit of a rebuilt offensive line, or at least a rebuilt approach to their offensive line that matches the strength, core, and focus of their rebuilt offensive scheme. It makes sense. Can the New Orleans Saints do it? That's remains to be seen, right? But I think that that's kind of the thing that you look at and you go, okay, well, Trevor Penning, it's not just on him, right? Like the team has to give him time. Like the amount of times, and I asked about this several times too, and credit to the Saints for at least like acknowledging like, yeah, it's a good question. Just we haven't had the opportunity to do it. But, all those times where they talked about like, oh, well, he just needs more experience. He needs more reps, all those other things. He's not getting experience. He's not getting reps sitting on the bench during games. And so like they want him up. They want him there at left tackle. So finding ways to get him there, rebuilding that confidence, rebuilding maybe a little bit. I can imagine maybe a little bit of trust is kind of diminished there. So rebuilding a little bit of that as well, especially with the new offensive line coach. I think there's a lot of things that could go right for this New Orleans Saints team when it comes to Trevor Penning and therefore for their offensive line in 2024. If they can capture that potential, right? Because all we're talking about right now is potential. That's fair. If they can capture that potential, they're in a much better place in 2024 than they were in 2023, without a doubt. So I think that's part of rebuilding your offensive line, is not necessarily restaffing Trevor Penning, but making sure that Trevor Penning is regaining his role and regaining his confidence in the meanwhile, while also getting a run game that's supportive of the offensive line, a passing game that's supportive of the offensive line, and of course, a new right tackle over on the right side if you need one, if Ryan Ramczyk is not ready to go at the beginning of the season, which at this point kind of feels likely, but we'll see. We'll see. I assume we'll talk to Mickey Loomis here in the coming days before the draft. I'm sure we'll get a lot of questions answered at that point as well. Coming up next, Could the New Orleans Saints potentially trade down? John Hendricks and I did a fun exercise in that with one of our 2 mock drafts over the most recent episode of Second and Saints. Let's take a look at what it could look like for the New Orleans Saints to trade down, why they probably won't do it, and what's the logic behind it. And we'll discuss whether or not it's sound. We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This segment is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp Therapy Online has been absolutely awesome for me. Sometimes it's nice to just get something off of your chest, especially to a third-party person that's kind of unbiased in your life, right? So today, I want to tell you something about how I feel that you might be wondering as well, especially if you saw this. And you might be thinking the same thing. So let me get something on my chest here. There was a recent mock draft that came out that featured the New Orleans Saints drafting 5 wide receivers and 2 cornerbacks, one of which is a Toronto player over in the CFL, I believe. Look, we do a lot of mock drafts knowing that they're going to be wrong, right? Most mock drafts are wrong. But a lot of it is about introducing you to new prospects and all other stuff. 5 wide receivers, let's just not be ridiculous when it comes to mock drafts. How about that? So just want to get that off my chest. Look, therapy can look different for everybody too. Sometimes it's complaining about mock drafts. Other times it's big situations for you. So you want to make sure you're getting those things off your chest every once in a while. So if you've been thinking about trying therapy, make sure you give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Just visit betterhelp.com/lockedon for 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Today's episode of Locked On Saints also brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It's time for the playoffs when it comes to the NBA and NHL. Baseball is officially in full swing. And of course, you can bet on every single game over at FanDuel. They even also have NFL draft props. Let me give you a little bit of an example here. Right now, FanDuel has Taliese Fuaga. Actually, my apologies. Yeah, Taliese Fuaga. I was right. Has Taliese Fuaga as the odds-on favorite to be the second offensive lineman off the board. His draft position is plus or minus 13.5. So is J.C. Latham. So it's not Olu Fashanu, who is the odds-on favorite to be the second guy off the board. It's Taliese Fuaga. That could mean good or bad things for the New Orleans Saints, with both Fuaga and Latham ranked higher than Fashanu when it comes to that. So whole bunch for you to check out over at FanDuel. And right now, new customers will get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. You bet on everything from slap shots to the NFL draft to runs and dunks, a whole bunch of stuff for you to check out, and an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. There might be a big cry out there for the New Orleans Saints to finally trade back, depending upon who's still on the board at 14, but it might not be the best choice, and it might not be the New Orleans Saints MO, which I think we know that for sure. We appreciate you very much for being here for another episode of Locked On Saints, making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, in tomorrow's episode, we're going to do one of my favorite episodes every draft cycle, the surprises that I think that can happen in the top 100 selections. So we'll look at pick 14 to lead off the show, pick 45. Look at the next show. What are some of the surprise selections that could happen? Non-offensive line, all that kind of stuff. What are some of the surprise selections that could happen? And who are some players that could be in conversation that might surprise you? We'll get to all of that in tomorrow's episode on Wednesday, and also take a look back at some of Mickey Loomis's comments and things like that if we get the opportunity to speak with him before. So whenever that happens, the next show will have some stuff from that as well. So as we take a look here at the New Orleans Saints and their potential to trade back, I think that the general consensus is that the Saints should consider trading back in this year's draft because they need more young players on the roster. Now, you can go out there and you can spend 10 selections, right? The Saints go in with 9. So if they were to trade back and pick up an extra spot, that would give them 10 selections they could choose from. It also gives you a little bit more mobility to be able to move up at a later point, things like that. But for the most part, like the idea around it oftentimes is move back, draft more players. And that's fine, but the tricky part of it is that when you move back, the MO or the thought process for the New Orleans Saints, justification for not moving back, is the idea that at 14, let's just say, you can make a selection of a player. You could trade back and pick up, John Hendricks and I traded back on Second and Saints earlier Monday, and we traded back for 22 and either 50 or 53. I think it was 50. From the Philadelphia Eagles to right the wrong of the trade that happened a couple years ago. And so with that, you're making the concession to say, okay, I could get Like, you get a player that I really like at 14. We had Taliese Fuaga, Olu Fashanu, and Troy Fautanu all on the board. JC Latham was already off the board at this point. But all three of those guys were all on the board at 14. So that's why we decided to trade back, move back 8 spots, and then all three of those O-line went off the board. And so we had to make a different selection at 22. So we went with Johnny Newton, the defensive tackle there. We'll discuss more about that in tomorrow's episode. And then come around to the second round where we had 45 and 50. We had Jackson Powers Johnson fall to us at 45. That was an easy selection, but very unrealistic. Although we saw almost that exact same thing happen with Eric McCoy years ago, where he fell to, I believe it was 45, to the New Orleans Saints, who was a first round guy that the Saints were able to draft in the second round, and it worked out great for him. So we drafted Jackson Powers Johnson because you can move in the guard. You get 3 centers, 3 high IQ guys all playing on your interior for you. And then at 50, Kieran Amagaji out of Yale was an easy selection for a guy that's played a lot of right tackle, 35-inch long arms, 6'5", 320, 315 pounds. Perfect fit for a starting right tackle. Now, he's a little bit more raw, a little bit more of a prospect, needs a little bit more development, but that's kind of the MO but that's part of the situation, the sacrifice that you make when you trade back. So Mickey Loomis has talked about this in his pressers, end of season pressers, all that kind of stuff about like trading back, that you're making the concession that you're going to select 2 lesser players than the one player that you took. Not that the 2 players are lesser combined, because you can't combine players, but you're taking a lesser player and a lesser player than what you could get. And so passing on a JC Latham, well, he was already off the board, but you get the idea. Passing on a JC Latham, passing on a Taliese Fuaga, passing on a Troy Fautanu, passing on an Olu Fashanu, even though 3 of the 4 of them were on the board at 14, we had to take a project guy, a little bit more of a developmental guy in the second round that may or may not pan out or has a higher risk of not panning out. Now, I like Kieran Amagaji. I think he's a very talented player. I think he would work just fine at right tackle. He's spent a lot more of his time. I think I called him a career right tackle. He's been more so a career left tackle over the course of the past couple of years. My apologies. But you're willing to deal with that, right? And that's the concession that you make. And maybe you land a Patrick Paul. The Patrick Paul's convinced he's going to be a first round pick late in day 1. Who knows? You could take Patrick Paul at 22 in that case, Tyler Guyton at 22. A couple different things they could do. So before I get too out of control here, just like throwing names and numbers out, I think that like the Saints' logic behind not trading back makes sense. Just because you're gathering more picks doesn't mean you're going to hit on more players. You're making the conscious effort to select lesser talented players when you move back. Whether you like to phrase it that way or not, that's the concession. That's the risk, the wager, the whatever that you're making, knowing that that's going to be the case when you decide to trade back. So that's why sometimes it doesn't work for the New Orleans Saints. Now, there are cases where maybe later on in the draft, you can make that decision, right? A lot of people only really talk about trading back when they talk about trading back in the first round, but the Saints could trade back from 45 potentially. If, let's say, they get to 45 and Keon Coleman, the wide receiver out of Florida State's off the board. Let's say Xavier Legette, the wide receiver out of South Carolina, is off the board. Tyler Nubin, the safety out of Minnesota, off the board. Some of the top defensive tackles like Johnny Newton and Byron Murphy, who might even be a top 10 pick this year, who knows, off the board. And so you're sitting there at 45 and you've already taken an offensive tackle at 14. Then yeah, maybe you're like, okay, well, I really like Malachi Corley, really like Tavondre Sweat, but don't want to give 45 for him, especially right now with everything going on with his off the field stuff and everything. Then maybe there's a chance to trade back, and maybe you're not necessarily getting a lesser player at that point. You're just keeping yourself from having to reach for the player that you want that you might otherwise be able to nab at 53 or something like that. You know what I mean? So maybe that's the place where it makes more sense to trade back. Trade back from 45 to 53, pick up a 4th round pick. Could be a way to go. Then you can trade that 4th round pick and one of your 5th round picks, try to get up back into the top 100 or just outside the top 100. Pick up a selection where, let's say that you move back from 45 to 53. Let's say you get Tavondre Sweat or Jatavion Sanders, the big tight end out of Texas. And then you pick up a 130, 120, and then you didn't get a wide receiver in the second round. You come back on the clock later on, and then you grab Brendan Rice out of USC, and then you've got your wide receiver and your tight end. I think there's value in that. So I think that that's the place where the New Orleans Saints, and if you think back to 2007 and 2006 when they traded back, they didn't trade back in the first round. They traded back late in the draft. those are the places where the value probably gets the opportunity to make more sense, especially in a draft class like this, which has a lot of talent in the top 100. It kind of falls off, and then the value comes back around 150 something, 170 something, depending upon how the board falls. I think there's a place where it makes sense for the New Orleans Saints to trade back. But honestly, I don't think it's in the first round. I think you take that offensive tackle that's on the board that's going to be an immediate starter for you at 14. You don't jeopardize that opportunity. Then you can make a decision after that at 45 to trade back, at 150 to trade back, like whatever, right? And then you can also move up from the 5th round with all those too. I think that there's this overwhelming kind of thought process sometimes where, like, if you draft more players, then more players work. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you draft 10 players and 3 of them make your roster. And then sometimes you draft 5 players and 5 players make your roster, and you're better off drafting the 5, drafting half the amount that you did because you took the quality over the quantity. Makes sense to me? I don't know. But yeah, I don't know that I would expect to see the Saints trade back in round 1. But if they were going to trade back, I think it happens later on in this draft. But for me, all my money is on the Saints packaging 5th round selections, future picks to move up in this draft into the 120, 3rd, 4th rounds, right? To get into that 3rd, 4th round area and then be ready to make some more selections at that point. So that's what I'm expecting from the New Orleans Saints. All right, y'all. That's what I'm expecting if they decide to move. And I think that they will. I don't think they're going to sit around and take all 4 of those selections in the 5th round and wait from 45 to 150. I don't think they're going to do that. All right. Appreciate you. Thank you very much for being here and for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Make sure you come back tomorrow. Biggest surprises that might happen at 14 and 45. And then we'll see whenever we get to speak with anybody within the New Orleans Saints organization pre-draft. We'll have some stuff for you from that as well. Appreciate you as always for making us your first listen of the day. Make sure you go check out Locked On Pelicans, Jake Madison, Angry Cast after they dropped game 1 over there. So make sure you go and check that out. And then LSU Jim, another world championship over at LSU. Make sure you go and check out Locked On LSU. Caroline Fenton. Appreciate you as always, making Locked On Saints part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.